Chapter 1 The Seer. Endo opened his eyes to a sea of stars, where every dot above him seemed to elegantly dance in the night sky. It was at this moment that he realized he was laying down. Closing his eyes once again, he took note of his senses. He could feel the grass on his fingertips and the chill of the wind on his skin. It was somehow both a familiar and a completely new feeling. Upon opening his eyes again, he noticed enormous mossy green trees surrounding his peripheral vision. They seemed to stretch on forever, as if they were trying to touch the stars themselves. He must be in some sort of grassy clearing inside a forest. How had he gotten here? Endo tried to remember, but the only thing that seemed to be stored in his brain was his name. He couldn't remember anything at all before he awoke. He laid on the grass for another moment before getting to his feet and circling the clearing. Walking around for an hour or so, he felt a pang in his stomach. Though he couldn't seem to remember who he was and how he had arrived here, he knew what this feeling was and how to correct it. Endo was hungry and he needed to eat. He closed his eyes and used his ears to take in the quiet around him. Except for the rustling of the wind and the surrounding trees, it was completely silent. At the point when the morning sun painted the sky in a golden sunrise, he heard a noise that didn't belong to the leaves around him. They were footsteps, and they were approaching him now. Coming through an opening from the trees into the clearing, Endo heard a low growl. What followed after was a large wolf, black and gray, and adorned with a set of sharp fangs protruding from his open mouth. Endo felt adrenaline pump into his head as he prepared himself for the beast to pounce. Both he and the wolf were hungry, and one of them was going to become a meal for the other. The wolf leapt, fangs bearing menacingly towards him. Endo rolled to his left and out of reach of the wolf's bite. He countered with a sharp jab at the beast's belly and heard the yelps around the clearing as the beast crumpled to the ground. Endo seemed to be much stronger than he realized, and though he couldn't remember fighting before, it seemed to come so naturally to him. It wasn't until the sun was high up into the clear blue sky that Endo had finished eating his attacker. His stomach was full now, but he needed to eat the meat from the entire creature before the hunger pains left him. He continued walking through the vibrant green forest until he came upon a stream filled with crystal blue water that matched the sky. He quenched his thirst for several minutes and felt himself revitalized. Sitting next to the flowing stream, he took the time to acknowledge his own appearance in the waters. He was burly and covered in hair that kept him warm despite the all-encompassing chill that seemed to approach when the sky grew dark. The skin on his body that wasn't covered in fur was almond-colored and slightly lighter than his hair. Why can't I recognize this face? Endo thought to himself. He could think, after all, even if he wasn't sure how to speak those thoughts aloud. He had a clear sense of self and simple goals he could accomplish. When he was hungry, he could hunt and eat. When he was thirsty, he could drink from the nearby streams. In this forest, marking the only sense of familiarity to him, he could survive, and so he did. The early morning sky had graced Endo many times after his awakening. He wasn't sure how many, but he didn't think about it much. He was more concerned with surviving in this forest. He had learned to hunt with his hands, and even used some of the animal pelts to fashion garments that kept him warm when the sky darkened. Though not all of the animals were his enemies, he actually quite enjoyed the presence of some of the other forest creatures, and could be found drinking the clear waters from the streams with them. Some of the animals, like wild goats and deer, seemed to enjoy his company as well, as they would not flee when he came near. This was likely because he never hunted animals that would not attack him. Wolves, bears, hyenas, and other vicious larger animals were his primary source of food for this reason. He very rarely found himself leaving the forest, and never went further than the grassy plains where the large trees became fewer. It was unknown territory, and he didn't see any practical reason to leave. Everything that he had needed could be found in this forest home. On one particularly sunny morning, Endo felt his hunger pains returning, pounding like a heartbeat in his stomach. He would sometimes eat grass and berries where he could find them, but felt it was never enough to keep his stomach full. He found himself stalking a leopard that he had fought just 2 nights before. He hadn't seen many of these beasts before, and suspected that they came from the great plains outside the forest. His suspicions were confirmed when the beast spotted him. With a look of recognition that became replaced with horror, it darted away with Endo giving chase behind it. He followed its path through the trees as they became fewer and fewer. By the time he had caught up to it, he was out into the plains where the bright green hills seemed to go on forever. He pounced onto the leopard, much like a leopard would pounce on its own prey, and killed it as quickly as he could. Though he enjoyed the difficult fights with these larger animals, Endo didn't find pleasure in killing them. He liked the challenge, and filling his stomach, of course, but he'd almost felt a kinship with these animals, a desire to befriend them in some way, and he almost always felt a sense of loneliness while he ate. These introverted thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the distance. How strange. These footsteps don't sound like anything I've heard before, Endo thought to himself. They were moving fast. It had to be another large animal, unlike anything he had seen before. He darted toward the sound on all fours, going as fast as his arms and legs would take him. The creature came into view, no bigger than a dot far off into the distance. Suddenly the creature stopped and stared in his direction. It had certainly seen him, but it wasn't fleeing and didn't seem to be preparing to attack. He sprinted closer and took notice of how peculiar this creature looked to him. It stood on all fours and didn't have typical feet. It seemed to have something smaller attached to it, and this creature only became more bizarre to him the closer that he got. These were two creatures. The smaller creature was riding the larger one's back. Stranger still, the smaller creature looked a lot like Endo. He had seen himself in his drinking water plenty of times by now, and had never realized how different he was from the other animals. But this humanoid animal seemed to look a lot more like him than any other. The larger creature let out a noise Endo had never heard before, while the smaller humanoid animal spoke to it. It appeared to be calming this larger creature down before dismounting from its back. This humanoid animal looked to be the same gender as Endo, but with a younger face and lighter hair. He was also wearing garments that Endo had never seen before. The young man began to speak to Endo, but Endo had no idea what he was trying to say to him. The younger man looked concerned, and this made Endo uneasy. When it became clear that Endo could not understand a single word he was saying, the young man began using simple hand gestures in an attempt to clarify. The young man pointed to himself and repeated the word Sahad. He then pointed to the larger creature and repeated the word horse. It took quite a long time for Endo to begin to grasp what he was being told, but eventually he believed he was beginning to understand. Sahad was a name that belonged to this young man, and horse must be the name of his larger companion. He didn't completely understand it. Endo was considerably less wary of Sahad because he looked so familiar to him, but he was completely devoid of fear once he was offered a bit of food. It was meat. He had tasted it before, but something was different about it. The taste was very different from the animals he had hunted. There were very different flavors currently attacking his taste buds, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. It wasn't bad, but it was extremely unfamiliar to him. He was also offered different nuts and berries that he enjoyed very much. With some coaxing from Sahad, Endo had followed him and horse south through the plains. Everything was completely new to him, almost overwhelmingly so, but he was enjoying himself nonetheless. He followed the pair through the grassy hills into flatland until nightfall, and when they stopped to set up camp, he stood transfixed while Sahad made a campfire. Endo had his hands swatted away a few times by Sahad when he tried to touch the flames, but his determination showed Endo to be the victor, and Endo had a burn on his hand to prove it. Endo awoke during the night to a sky completely filled with stars, but for the first time that he could remember, there were no trees surrounding his peripheral vision. The only sound that could be heard aside from the campfire was the sound of crickets. He was warm, relaxed, and hadn't felt those hunger pains in his stomach in almost a full day. In this moment, while drifting back to sleep, Endo felt completely at peace. The trio traveled together for many days and nights, where Endo learned more efficient ways to hunt. They rarely had to hunt for prey themselves, as Sahad would lay down medium-sized metal traps to catch their food. Never in his wildest dreams had Endo imagined using a method like this to get food. They would set up their camp, sleep through the night, and have a creature waiting for them the next morning. Endo also saw firsthand why Sahad's meat had tasted so different. He would use their fire to cook it, and sometimes even sprinkle odd things on top of it. He wasn't the biggest fan of this method of eating at first, but after having it frequently, he had forgotten how it had tasted before it was cooked. This was the first of many new things to come for Endo, and he had no idea how little he was scratching the surface. Sahad struggled to get Endo to understand him, and though his words were definitely becoming increasingly understood, Endo still had a ways to go to fully grasp the language. One word that he was hearing frequently from Sahad was Sid, and he began to think it was Sahad's home, similar to the forest that Endo had called home. But the forest was far out of their view now, replaced by endless grass in all directions, with occasional interruptions by large stretches of grassy hills. Endo had long become accustomed to the bright green all around him by the time they had finally found different terrain. There were enormous mountains coming into view now, where the plains looked to be met by rivers to the east and the west. The mountains lay behind the two rivers, following their seemingly endless direction, while the plains continued to the south. Endo could tell that they were getting close to whatever their destination seemed to be, closer to this Sid place that Sahad had apparently called home.